Hi, welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to look at the hanging of British Major John André. And for a lot of our listeners, that may not be something they're specifically familiar with, but I'm sure a lot of our listeners are familiar with Benedict Arnold and his attempted betrayal of the United States at West Point. And John André, of course, is caught right up in the middle of that.
So this is one of those like really cool stories. There's so much that goes on to this. And Ray, I believe that, as we get into it, I think we'll see another podcast coming along just in one of the other characters who is really involved in this. And that is Peggy Shippen, who has just a fascinating part in this drama that is the young and the restless that meets British and American. They come together. And I remember, I want to say that there was a TV show. I think it was a TV show. I think it was called Turn. I think, which talked about spying during George Washington's days and things like that. It was really good historical drama. And I think that's where I saw a dramatization of kind of how these events unfold with Arnold and Andre and Shippen. And I was mesmerized by the elaborate scheme and the ability to almost pull this off. And if this would have happened, it would have just probably destroyed America. If these guys would have been successful in what they were trying to do.
Absolutely. I mean, turning over West Point to the British and all, not just simply the location itself, but all the people, there. I think it was some 4,000 men there at West Point. It would have had a devastating impact on the war. And Benedict Arnold, when we talk about him, a lot of people know about him. But what a lot of people don't know about Benedict Arnold, I think, is that he was actually, before his infamous betrayal, he was actually a hero of the Continental Army. He had done some very amazing things for the Patriot cause, but he had never gotten, I guess you could say, the appreciation or the recognition he believed he was due. And as a result, it left him open to someone like Peggy Shippen, who I believe he met in Philadelphia while he was there. And she comes from this loyalist family. And I guess you could say a combination of a leg injury plus disappointment, dissatisfaction, plus romantic feelings toward Peggy Shippen. Benedict Arnold was pulled down the path of betraying everything he had worked for up to that point.
Well, I know that our focus today is on the other side of the waters and looking at, the British individual that was involved, who was John André. And just thinking about John André, here's this guy. If you just kind of look at John André, you wouldn't see him as a military leader, right? Because he was fluent in 4 languages. He was a writer. He was a poet. He was like a romantic. And the interesting thing is that the only reason he gets a military commission, that he finds himself as a lieutenant in the British Army, is that he had inherited his father's fortune and bought his way into the military. And besides that, when you look at this guy, he's everything but a soldier. He is, a swooner. He is one that, he's a player, I guess, if you would use today's language, where he's able to kind of find his way into things. And that's basically what happens. I don't know. I don't want to go too much in Peggy, because I think that's a whole other podcast, but using Peggy and seeing him in this role, he becomes a friend, a confidant to, who was it? Henry Clinton, I think, of the British, was kind of the commanding general in North America. So he rises up the ranks using his smooth talk, using his mind. But while he's doing that, he's moving up the ranks of the American side, establishing this secret correspondence with Benedict Arnold. And he finds himself in this awkward yet very valuable, if you look at it in John André's eyes, place where he has connections at the highest level of the British Army. And now he's having valuable correspondence with someone who's high up in the Continental Army.
Yeah, the British, when they got word, when Hillary Clinton, I'm sorry, when Henry Clinton had got word that, there was a high level American soldier ready basically to defect to the British side, of course, he's a little suspicious. And is this real? Is this some sort of stunt? What's going on here? So, of course, he puts John André, so to speak, on the case, find out as much as you can, get as much information as you can. So André and Arnold, work together over an extended period of time, I guess, coming up with the plans on how they're going to transfer West Point from the Americans to the British, and thus also Benedict Arnold getting his reward, so to speak. And John André, you mentioned he was a very well-educated, very charismatic young man, only about 29, 30 years old when this was going on. This is a man who had a future. This is a man who had a real future in the British Army, maybe even in British politics. One person I read in preparation for this said that John André was to Henry Clinton what Lafayette was to George Washington. That's how close André was to Clinton. This was a personal connection, not just simply a professional connection, but a personal connection between André and Clinton. And I think Clinton knew, he very well knew the dangers that potentially awaited André as he continued to work with Benedict Arnold. And I guess, Chris, that brings us to that fateful series of events that brought about André's capture.
Well, we are for the focal point of this is, as you mentioned, West Point. And people, today, when they hear West Point, they think of the College of the Army as West Point being Army. And, at the time, it was a defensive post that was just, I think, 60 miles north of New York City. But it was a defensive post that the Americans had control of. And not the Americans, I guess the colonists had control of. And the British saw West Point as a key place. If we could just get West Point, then what's going to happen is New England will be cut off from the middle colonies and the southern colonies. So this is pretty much that image of kind of like the snake. If we can chop off the head, then the British said we'll be successful. So we're going to take this area, this defensive post, West Point. If we can just get it, we'll be successful. The only problem is that it is very fortified. It is a strong defensive place. And this guy named Benedict Arnold, who you have said is a hero in the Continental Army. He is a hero of previous battles. And here he is, having been placed in command of West Point. But Ray, it goes to also show that people are always looking for something bigger and looking for something better. It's, here's this guy who, yes, he's in charge of the command of West Point, but this better just because of the relationship that Washington had with Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold, he wasn't really happy during this point because of some things that have been happening, I think, with Washington and kind of in the Army in general. And so it's a very vulnerable time for Arnold as he's really trying to figure out where he belongs in the Continental Army.
Yeah, and really he came to the conclusion, and like we said earlier with Peggy Shipman and some of these other, that he maybe didn't have a place in the Continental Army, that he would be better off in the British Army. So John André goes to Henry Clinton.
And you just said something really interesting there, that that maybe he thought he had a better place in the British Army, I think is what you said.
Right.
And we think about that today. It's like, oh my gosh, I mean, really going for the other team. I mean, what a huge decision. But as you mentioned earlier, back then, yeah, it's a big decision, but you still have a lot of loyalists that are still in these areas. I mean, it wasn't like it's the colonists against the British. The colonists had some loyalists that were like, look, we don't want to mess around with the redcoats, the army. We don't want to mess around with the king and parliament. We're fine. We're content. Yeah, we kind of got, the raw end of the deal on some taxes, but we can live with that. So, I don't know. It's a little bit different when we hear it in today's society saying he's going from colonists to the British. But back then he was like, hey, whatever's going to give me the best play, I can go with.
And really, if you think about it, and I don't want to downplay necessarily what Arnold did, trying to turn over West Point. But if you go back and you look at the period of the American Revolution, there were a lot of everyday Americans who they weren't really dedicated loyalists. They weren't really dedicated patriots. They may have shifted loyalties from day to day, even sometimes hour to hour, based on what they thought would benefit them at the moment. What do I need to do to protect my farm from being plundered? What do I need to do to protect my family? What do I need to do to keep my business open? If the patriots are in town and they're the big dogs in town, well, I'm going to sort of go with them because I don't want to get in trouble. But if the loyalists are the big dogs a week later, well, that's who we're going to for the same reason.
So let's just imagine the scenario. You're married to a woman who is from a very elite family, who is very well known. Daddy has a lot of money. And so you want to marry up because that looks good and all. So let's say you marry her and all of a sudden she starts spending your money instead of daddy's money. And you're not getting paid much to serve in the military, very little. And you're having to fight with that in the first place just to get your payment. So you've got your wife spending all of your money and you're thinking, wait a second, I'm going to be in financial ruin if I don't do something. And then you just have a chance encounter with this poet, this philosopher, this romantic, this guy who's really, really good at words. And he comes to you and says, hey, you give me West Point and I'll give you what is about $4 million in today's currency. Well, you start loyalty and you're like, financial ruin. I'm just giving up West Point. I mean, it's just one small part. I mean, they won't miss it too much. I mean,
my life is going to be greatly improved.
$4 million takes care of everything my wife's doing.
And I'll be on better standing with my father-in-law because he's a loyalist.
So do I want to be in good standing with my father-in-law or do I want to be in good standing with Washington? Yeah. Well, Washington and him are not on the same page necessarily. He kind of feels like he's getting, shifted down in place of other people in higher positions. Go back to Hamilton. Lafayette comes in a little later. I mean, all these people are getting better gigs than he's getting. So I'm not trying to justify what Arnold does, nor am I justifying what André, but André's simply in the right position at the right time. And the way that I see this is André doesn't really like pester him with it. He just goes to him and says, hey, dude, I got $4 million. You give me the plans to West Point. We capture it. We'll take care of you. You can defect to the army and we'll give you the prestigious title of general. You'll be higher up in the British Army. And I mean, all he had to do, André, was use his words.
Yeah.
And that's what he does. He just uses his words. And Arnold's like, well, my situation dictates I probably need to accept the offer.
Yeah, and it didn't take much, I'm sure. Where Arnold was in his life at this point didn't take much. So Andre, John Andre goes to Henry Clinton and asks, and they're in New York City at this particular point in time, and he asks to meet with Arnold. So he's going to take a trip from New York City to a British warship called the Vulture. What a wonderful name for a ship, by the way. I mean, the Vulture. I like that. But this British warship called the Vulture, which was anchored down on the Hudson, just a few miles from where Benedict Arnold was sort of hanging out. And what I find interesting, and I read this in several accounts, is that Henry Clinton had warned Andre, stay in your uniform. Whatever you do, when you go on land, you keep that uniform on, because that means you are a representative of our government. And that's going to be John André's downfall. That's going to be his downfall, is that he doesn't keep his uniform on. He gets to the Vulture. And on September 21st, 1780, a guy called Joshua Smith goes to the Vulture, and he's got papers for one John Anderson, who is John André. And they bring John André back to shore where Arnold is waiting. And they go to the house of Joshua Smith. And there they have a very long conversation, a very long meeting. And I'm sure, Chris, there was a lot of logistics to work out, how all this was going to be done. Well, when all that was happening, when they were there longer than they were supposed to be, the Vulture had to relocate. So that meant that Andre was basically on his own. He's in enemy territory. By this point, he's pretty much by himself. I mean, the Vulture has moved. It's further away. He's going to have to make his way back to New York City, on foot, so to speak. And he makes a series of very bad mistakes at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about these mistakes that he makes, I really think that he was focused on the ultimate prize and didn't think through all of the steps that would have to go along with it. I mean, he is stopped by some members of the militia who start, interrogating him. And, he's been given this free pass from Arnold saying he can kind of travel around the region. But, one of the things that tip him off is he's a romantic in the way that he speaks, in the way that he talks. If he's in uniform, as you mentioned, he's fine. But the way that he talks, it gives him off. This is not just some country boy out there just kind of meandering around. There's something really interesting. And so they begin to do like a frisk on him, right? They start to search. And is it, I think that they found the map, right? They had found the map of West Point, and was it in his boot?
Yeah, there were several documents, including a map in his boots. And again, the key here is he's out of uniform.
Right. And so, go ahead.
And not only that, another mistake he makes at this point, when he comes across these three guys, he supposes them to be Hessians. So he thinks they're allies, so he runs his mouth. And he ends up telling them who he is. And so that's when they search him and discover the incriminating documents in his shoes.
And I mean, now the interesting thing, once again, this is on Andre, but while all this is happening and while Andre gets caught, Benedict Arnold, he's already making his way across the lines there, and he's kind of finding himself in safety, if you will, because he's made his way to the British lines. And that's just another issue, because Washington then says, okay, let me go try to figure out what's going on. He finds out that West Point hasn't been fortified like he had asked. He finds Arnold's kind of gone. And all of a sudden he starts getting reports from, these guys, hey, we've got something fishy going on. Next thing you know, Washington says, oh, I've been duped and I've got the guy that's a part of it. I don't have Arnold, but I've got you. And, there's a lot that I can do with Andre. And so he orders his arrest. And that's where I don't know, you're the Washingtonian guy, but I have a lot of interest about what Washington does in this situation. I just think it's pretty, Washington, father of the country. A lot of people kind of see Washington as this reserved individual, don't cut down the cherry tree. We don't see him like the rage and the anger, but I think in this aspect, you see Washington's true side, and you see his anger, but his humility, but also his fight for, what it is that he's doing, in trying to secure liberty for America. And, tell me, maybe I'm wrong with this, but I thought that I read somewhere that Washington actually admired Andre, that he was gentlemanly like Washington, he was charismatic like Washington, and that really they kind of bonded in a way. Am I right in that?
I think you are. He did. He mentioned, and I forget, I don't know if I've got it in my notes here, but he did mention that he here it is. He says, quote, Andre has, this is after John André's hanging, has met his fate, and with that fortitude which was expected from an accomplished man and a gallant officer, end quote. Washington definitely admired Andre on a personal level, maybe on a professional level, but you got to remember George Washington is furious. He is absolutely livid. And you're right. There was another side to Washington. He understood this. He had a temper. He could go off the rails pretty quick, and he worked very hard, based on things he learned as a young man and also as an adult, that he needed to work to keep that under wraps, so to speak, to maintain his coolness. So what he does with Andre after this panel, this court finds Andre guilty, is he sort of views it as, look, Andre was out of a uniform, therefore he's a spy, therefore he has to be hung. Textbook case. That's pretty much Washington's view of it. He does, through people, Henry Clinton contacts him through a letter. And Washington makes clear, look, I will hand John André back over to you, but you got to give me Benedict Arnold. And Henry Clinton, as much as he loved John André, wasn't about to do that. So I think for Washington, he gave Henry Clinton, he gave John André an opportunity to get out of this situation, but they didn't take it. So from that standpoint, I think he viewed himself as being backed into a corner. I don't have a choice. I can't let this guy go. I have got to see this through at this point. I think that's where he was.
And isn't it true that technically, and I think Andre actually asked Washington to do the gentlemanly thing of, hey, if you're going to kill me, shoot me. That's how I'd rather die. And Washington basically said, that's a firm no. I'm going to hang you because you are a traitor. But wasn't that sort of in retaliation because the British had captured Nathan Hale, the former American patriot who was captured, and he wasn't given a trial. Remember, he was accused of espionage, and they treated him as a spy and hung. So do you think that maybe Washington was thinking about Nathan Hale, which is why he said, hey, yeah, I might have some respect for you as far as who you are, but you are a spy, and look at what your guys did to me with my team, and you won't give me Arnold. So I'm not going to shoot you. I'm going to hang you, because hanging was the ultimate, what's the right word? I mean, if you were hanged, that was a sign that you were a horrible person. You had done horrible wrong, and there was no justice or mercy for you. So, do you think that played in it some?
It probably did. I mean, the situation you mentioned is actually, speaking of another podcast, that's a whole nother episode of the podcast, because Washington responds to that situation immediately with, well, I'm going to go and we're going to find a higher officer that we have in custody, and we're just going to execute him, this random person. He ends up not doing it. He ends up having to back away from that. But I think there may be some aspect of that playing in here, that he still is maybe a little miffed over that. That definitely could play in here, because, I mean, you certainly understand that.
And the fact, I mean, Washington even stated that if this deal would have gone through, if the betrayal would have happened, and if André would have gotten the map of West Point into the hands of General Clinton, he basically said this would have been one of the worst things that could have happened to our military. We probably would have lost the war if it had succeeded. So I think he pretty much had, as you mentioned, he was backed in a corner, and they basically, he had no choice. But what's interesting to me is that, here is this man who is hanged, who is seen as a spy, and and we all know about Benedict Arnold, but the people in England loved John André. Even after his death, he was seen as a martyr. He was seen as a hero, and even to this day, people still see André in England and eyes as a hero.
Yeah, Washington got a lot of bad press over this. There were people, including Hillary. I want to say Hillary. Why am I trying to say Hillary? Henry Clinton never forgave Washington for this. I mean, it was not only a personal thing; it was from his point of view, I think it was a professional thing. I requested that this guy not be, executed, but you did it anyway. And not only did you do it, you did it in the most ignominious way you could dream up. Then there were a lot of people, even John André's captors, who came to admire him. And so it wasn't just British people who criticized the decision. Of all people, Alexander Hamilton criticized the decision as well, making clear that this was a bad move. So this was something that Washington got a lot of backlash on, in large part because of who John André was. His what you've talked about so far, Chris, his education, his ability to win friends among people. This wasn't some profanity rattling nasty person. This was a well-respected person who was very friendly, very nice on the surface anyway, won friends easily, and people liked him. And so when he met this fate, there were a lot of people angry at Washington. But George Washington was one of those guys who, I think most of the time, unless you could prove to him that he was wrong, once he made a decision, he wasn't one to go back on it again, unless you could prove, Mr. Washington, you need to rethink this.
My last question. I'm sorry, I'm asking you a lot of questions today on this one, but I'm just fascinated. Played Monday morning quarterback. If Washington decides to do something besides the hanging a very prominent, very respected, admired member of the British Army, is there the potential that maybe the war goes in a different direction? You mentioned Hillary. Hillary, you made me do it. If Clinton sees, if they have this, where they have this something we can agree on, you know what I mean? That Clinton, or is this still King is ticked off at the colonists are ticked off at the King? It doesn't matter what Clinton and Washington do. There's going to be an all-out war. But I just wonder, Monday morning quarterback, did Washington's actions just precipitate the anger even more between these two sides? or could it have maybe thawed it a little bit?
I don't know if it would have thawed it. I don't know. I think Henry Clinton probably would have thought better of Washington.
Hmm.
Would it have affected the war? I don't know. I wouldn't think. But I mean, Washington would probably, and I hate to put words in someone's mouth who's been dead well over 200 years, but I think Washington would say, well, that would be a dangerous precedent, wouldn't it? And here you
Well,
spy. We need to make an example out of this man. Otherwise,
and that's the thing that Washington, I think he always does, is he wants to make an example, right or wrong. He's like, you put me in this position. This is my decision. It is the one that I think is best, and I'm going to go with it. Even though he acted irrationally on a few occasions, a few times, but for the most part, he always was judicial in what he was going to do. And in this case, saying it's the right decision, because if we let Andre go, I mean, because there's plenty of other spies out there, so if we don't do this to Andre, what else are people going to do? So
there were threats to Washington's life, to his safety. He had to put together a guard, sort of like a personal guard, because of threats to his safety. So I'm sure he looked at this situation and thought, we need to make clear that this type of spying will not be tolerated. And look, we can question Washington and did he do the right thing? Should he have done differently? But remember, all John André had to have done was to kept that uniform on. If he'd been wearing that British uniform, he would have just been a prisoner.
Yeah, and I do. It's interesting to me also. We talked about he was a hero. Andre was a hero back home, but in the research that I found, there is a marker at the place that he was executed, and I found it interesting that not executed but hanged at the place that he was hanged. Is that quote that you mentioned earlier by Washington, talking he was more unfortunate than criminal. Interesting on American soil that there is a monument in Andre's honor for potentially, ruining the American movement. That's weird.
I think that shows how likable John André was.
I mean,
that he was a likable guy, even if he was doing something that the Americans, especially Washington, clearly was not really to tolerate.
And we still have a monument that is in his honor in America. It
is because when you think of Benedict Arnold himself, people put Benedict Arnold in the same category as Judas Iscariot. I mean, these two, but here you got John André, who was plotting with Arnold, and because I think of his personality and his likability.
Nobody likes Arnold.
No,
the British didn't even like Arnold. I mean, nobody liked Benedict Arnold. I mean, but Andre was well liked, even by the guy who orders his execution. Still said a respectful man. Got I mean, it just goes to show you, a tragedy, but also a tale of two different people who were still involved in the same exact thing.
History never fails to educate. History never fails, in my opinion anyway, to entertain, if it's taught correctly.
Yeah.
Big if there. It never fails to educate. It never fails to entertain. And it never fails, and I think this goes in the educate category, but it never fails to teach us lessons about, in this case, following protocol, doing, if Andre had just simply had that uniform on, something so simple, how different this whole story would have turned out. So anyway, that's my plug for history today. Not sure it was a very good one, but I tried.
I thought it was a great podcast. I really appreciate you bringing out the topic, and I don't know about our listeners, but I really want to delve into the other side of the affair, as Andre would say, with good old Peggy, because that's
let's look at Peggy next time. Peggy Shipman next episode. Our listeners have something to look forward to. Please share this podcast with your family and friends if you've enjoyed it. Like us on Facebook, on Twitter. You can always contact us on social media by email at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history of the letter you should know @gmail.com. We're available all over wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.